due to the fact that we're having a panel discussion today, I won't be reading the speakers' biographies out loud like I did the past days. Instead, I would like to ask each of the speakers to briefly introduce themselves, maybe starting with Alex. Oh, oops. Yeah, now I think it should work.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Alex. So nice to have you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Alex Darby. I like to call myself a lot of things, but for the purpose of this context, my interaction with jewelry is what I call as a speculative jeweler. I'm trained as a jeweler, but I really like to think of my practice in a bit more of a kind of critical lens. I'm also the curator of a project called the Jewelry Phone, which is part of Munich Jewellery Week as well. And the Jewelry Phone is kind of a larger extension of my practice that asks a lot of questions about how we perceive jewelry as a practice, as an art form, and really tries to kind of use technology as a tool to get people out of their thinking around what jewelry can mean and how we can kind of think about it more broadly beyond the kind of constructs of what is, a very kind of physical and defined medium. So I'm really interested in the intersection of art and technology. And for me, that art is jewelry. And a lot of my work really kind of questions, value and people's perceptions of how we can view and experience and think about and hopefully talk about jewelry. So I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks so much, Annalene, for inviting me.
Thanks so much for this wonderful introduction. Diving right in with some interesting topics. Thank you so much, Alex. So the next person that we see here on our little screen on the top corner is Darja. Can you please briefly introduce yourself? You should. We can't hear you. I'm not sure if you... Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, now, okay.
Yes. Welcome. Yeah. So nice for having you.
My name is Darja Popolitova, and I'm a jewelry artist based in Tallinn, Estonia. I also occasionally teach at Estonian Academy of Arts at the jewelry department to use digital technologies in creative practice, also do my PhD, and I'm exploring how can I influence the viewer with an audio-visual image of jewelry. So inevitably, my research focus includes digital images of jewelry and artistic practice. So I'm interested if there are any qualities of jewelry images that could contribute to viewers' so-called embodied experiences, to visceral sensations, emotions, and feelings. And if yes, how can these qualities be communicated via artistic works? So yeah, I use exhibitions as a laboratory to answer these questions. And I would be happy to share some of my findings, observations, and processes today, and to connect them with today's topic of our panel discussion, which is artificial intelligence in jewelry.
Yes, very much looking forward to that. Thank you so much. Lee, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure thing. I think Dovilė is going to maybe give some insight into why I'm here as a collaborator, but I'm certainly glad to give a background on myself, perhaps after she introduces us as a duo. Sorry for the mix-up here.
No, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
You go ahead.
That makes sense, Lee. Thank you. Yeah, so I am here with Lee because our recent project is looking at artificial intelligence through jewelry and also add jewelry through artificial intelligence. So we both are collaborating on this project, which is part of Gen Z program that Current Obsession has put out this last year, which is going to be presented in November this year. And we are looking at this through a particular amulet, a jewelry kind of iconic amulet of the evil eye. So there are many different questions we are focusing on. Of course, more broadly, it's about the potential of creativity of AI, but also how we can make sense of that and explain that through jewelry, which is such a personal and intimate object. But my name is Dovilė Bernadišiūtė, by the way. I am from Lithuania originally, but since 2013, I live in Stockholm in Sweden and work there as well, where I finished my master's degree in 2015 at Konstfack School of Arts and Design in Stockholm. And since then, I have been actively participating in the jewelry field. Mainly, my work was related to the human body and the built space in various instances. But lately, I'm looking at the digital place, the digital space, and our virtual selves. So Lee is helping me on the technical side more, on the creative technical side, and I'm more on the creative side. And we are going to create some jewelry using a specific algorithm that we can talk about later on. So maybe Lee, you want to say something also about yourself?
Thank you so much, Dovilė. And Annaline, and thank you so much for having us. Really appreciate the collaboration. And so just a little bit of background about myself. I'm based in New York City at the moment. I'm finishing a program in data visualization. So trying to understand uncertainty around how we visualize things with data. But I'm actually trained as a lens maker. So my background is mostly in optics. And in that time, I've started companies for making bespoke handmade eyewear for people out of a number of different materials from a jeweler's perspective. So my work is mainly about seeing. It's about vision. It's about human sensing through vision. And I think artificial intelligence in jewelry allow us to say significant things about where we are right now as a society. So, and especially this project working on it with Dovilė, I think will be very interesting to explore in today's conversation. So thank you so much.
Yes, definitely. We're very much looking forward. I'm quickly going to close the
curtain before I light on fire.
Because it's quite sunny here in Belgium today, actually, which is awesome. Okay, so as a first question, I'd like to ask if any of you would like to share a question that the live dreaming that we just saw, or maybe like the project in general, triggers or proposes. Like, is there, like, what is the main question for you that comes to mind when you see this live dreaming, or when you think about the project, or think about AI and jewelry? Go ahead.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was listening to yesterday's and Wednesday's or Thursday's talks as well, which was extremely interesting. And one of the things that I think yesterday's speaker mentioned is that we should see data as material, like paint is for a painter, for example. So then I was thinking about, well, obviously our own project, but also your project, in terms of where the images of jewelry come from and what kind of material we are using and who put it out there, or who made these images and so on. I think that's interesting to discuss. On our side, we are using images from the Smithsonian Museum's database. So these are images that they made and made public recently of jewelry, and specifically the evil eyes. But then we are using a totally generic image database of cars from the, I don't even know where it's from. Lee, help me out here. But I think it's interesting where it comes from. What does it mean when we use it? Because if this is the material we use, then it should be perhaps intentionally chosen or somehow.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, Dovilė, and especially because the images, like the data that you train the algorithm on, as you say, which is like the material of the work. In the case of the artificial intelligence project, it's images of other people's work. So there is like also this extra layer of
collaboration
between us and the AI, as well as us and the many participants of the project. But then also interestingly, all the images also get translated through code. So there are like these many layers, and like you've just mentioned, it's almost more of a question than an answer. Like what exactly is the material that we're working with here, or like how do you see it yourself in the context of your own project that you're currently working on with machine learning?
I think it's difficult. I think we should think about it more as well. What we are doing is that we are trying to have this feedback loop between the algorithm and ourselves. So whatever it first puts out, we are inspired by to make watercolors of at the moment. And then we are scanning these watercolors and putting it back to the algorithm. And so kind of merging our own work with the first AI images that it produced. It is an interesting result, but it's just the beginning as well. I don't know, Lee, if you have anything to add on our...
Yeah, no, it's such an interesting, I think, question about this feedback loop between the AI and us as collaborators, because it doesn't really stop there. And I mean, we've talked a little bit briefly about this idea that there's a kind of explainability problem within AI at the moment. And we're trying to investigate why is that really the case? You know, why, if you have a neural network and all these layers that are sort of hidden or black boxes, and we have difficulty explaining the process to somebody, the expression of this feedback loop between the artist and the AI, I think helps to provide a lens of seeing that relationship more clearly. So that might be just another way to consider this process for us, that it's an investigation, it's an exploration, it's a discovery. The question that I would have around that is, how do we wear uncertainty as makers of jewelry?
Yeah, and I think we are on the jewelry part, the physical material part, we are going to showcase that feedback loop as opposed to the finished object that AI created for us. At the moment, we still have a lot of work to do and tests and experiments, but yeah, we're looking at that sequence from where it starts, what happens throughout, and what happens at the end. Perhaps in beads.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's also like almost like this mechanical process almost that like the machine is doing in a certain way that you then maybe
come a part of.
Yeah, or like use as an inspiration or like translate again to your own practice. Because I'm very curious to ask you, how did working with machine learning influence your artistic practices? Like, did it change somehow because of like the characteristics or like how it works? Did you notice some influence on your practice?
I think there's that big question, of course, of I mean, it's like we are collaborating with Lee, but then we are collaborating with the algorithm as well, which is a big influence to the practice because I have never done that before, or it's very much I don't know how to call it, but I am very much the decision maker of everything when I make jewelry. And this is really dynamic somehow. It is really a feedback, because whatever the output is, it informs the next step, which is a totally different way of making something, I think. Also, the first making images, which could be sketches, but I, for example, don't make sketches. So to work from an image to a material, which we are going to do. I know, Annalyn, that you are not decided yet if you will make those pieces physical, even though I would love to see them physical. So please consider it. But yeah, that part is really tricky still, and I think it's the challenging part to take it from an image to a material, because this is the big transition, I think. And I think that Darja is doing that a lot in her work, and I was just meaning to hear from her how she thinks about extracting that tactility that she was saying when we were talking last time from images, from digital images.
Yeah, I really, at the same, no, I wanted to share one story that happened to me in regard to your idea to execute the pieces in real materials, to execute these images, you know. So yesterday I was watching the dreaming session and made some screen grabs from this ornamutations. And thereafter, I posted them to Instagram story while illustrating with some text that tomorrow I will be participating in a panel discussion about artificial intelligence and jewelry. So please join. And one friend of mine sent us a message. Is it your piece? And then I asked, did you think that this is my piece because of some sort of similarity with my works? And she said, yes. And I asked her if she thought that the piece was real, and she also confirmed that. And I said, no, the algorithm that was fed different images of jewelry, it produced this image based on what it was learned. And then she asked, it is like your collection of these 3D printed rings, but my collection was done in a way that I used 3D files that I found on the internet. You know, you Google some kind of 3D files for free download, you know, and digital ready-mades. And it's like, okay, it seemed to me very interesting associations. And I then said, no, yeah, it's just an image. And then she said, and if I would like it to be real, you know, and I said jokingly, it's not enough just to want. And she asked, how to feed the algorithm? And I said, you have very interesting questions, you know. And after I went to sleep and I had very kind of fantasy-like dreams. And in my dream, they were very weird-looking, colorful mattresses. And after I woke up, I realized that these mattresses looked actually very similar to the visual I saw yesterday, you know. And then I thought about my Instagram chat with a friend, and what if I want these images to be real? Because they were made out of, in my dream, or out of fabric, out of this quilted fabric filled with cotton, such a 3D mattresses. And it's pity I didn't think to jump on them in my sleep. But anyway, the second thought was, what I just been fed to produce these images in mattresses in my dream, you know. So therefore, here are large topics that could be formulated in questions like, what happens if I use the AI generated image in my in some material, you know? Is it copying or interpretation, right? Whom do I steal from? What sort of conceptual tension will emerge if I execute the shape by hand manually, or if I try to turn this 2D image into 3D form by some 3D software, and could my artistic imagination be formed by digital images? And I think like it's interesting because I saw it in my dream and it was kind of real. And in my opinion about this, that not only algorithm is fed jewelry images, but we as artists are algorithm themselves actually, because I found really exciting term in William Flusser writing about so-called techno imagination. So it means that when it's basically mean that images serve as a model for thinking. So a digital image of an airplane is not a representation of an airplane, but the idea of what the airplane might be in a given period of cultural and societal development. So the stage of technological development of the plane, or one could say also technological development of a camera, So this image can serve as a model for future construction, aircraft construction. So once an image can be used to control what it represents, it also becomes a technology in a way. So coming back to my matrices, does the image control me, or I as an artist control the image? And if we think about this, our generation of jewelers, so we all watch this jewelry activists, Instagram, Klimt, Art Jeweler Forum, Current Obsession. So if to think about digital images as about something that shapes our ideas of what contemporary jewelry might be at the current state of time. So this becomes very kind of frightening, and at the same time very interesting. So yeah, I was thinking about, and it started all from the question: could I execute this image or to copy this image in order to make this real? Yeah, so it's quite intriguing. But are you kind of planning to make them jewelry as well, or as some different object?
First of all, that was an incredibly fascinating story. I loved how you how the dreaming influenced your dreaming, and how you envisioned these crazy mattresses. To come back to your question, I'm intrigued by the fact that it proposes jewelry that is not possible in real life, so to speak, or this continuously evolving shapes, fluid, as if it's like a creature that is constantly moving and transforming. This fascinates me a lot, and this is something that I think would be quite a challenge to try to translate in something physical, which is why I'm quite interested in that as well. But then I think I would be more interested in how to grasp this idea of the constantly transforming into something material, rather than copying or copying the image and making it into a physical piece, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Maybe I find the idea more interesting, how to catch the concepts, and maybe it will look different than the image, but it has a certain similar essence, rather than using the image as a sketch for a piece, which would also be possible. But then, as you've just mentioned, both of you yourselves, the project really raises questions concerning authorship and ownership, and what if we would now select some of those generated images and turn it into something? Who is that work from? What can we do with it? From who is the artist? Who? I think that Alex, probably, yeah, I see you unmute yourself, but you probably have some ideas about that as well, because we briefly discussed it before, this topic.
Yeah. I mean, I want to come back to some, well, not come back, but sort of come full circle to something that you said in the beginning that kind of like, you know, brings forward this connectivity between materiality, between authorship, and between this, you know, what Darja was just saying about this kind of how heavily influenced we are by images that then, you know, force us to create or force us to create in a certain way, like who's controlling who. This idea of like layers of materiality. And like when you were saying that, Annalene, I was thinking about how, you know, in this process, like to use your project as an example, there is a relationship between materials or materiality that is inert and materials or materiality that are maybe more, have some more control kind of executed upon them, for example. So like, you know, the materials that come together to create the pieces, the artists who are involved in creating these pieces, and then the images that are resulting in those. And then to think about, you know, what Dovilė was saying, you know, about data being the material. And so it's like, it's interesting to think about along this entire process, like how materiality changes in terms of agency, activity, ownership, and to think about it in this term of like materials are potentially part of the input, but a new material is also part of the output. And like what you were just saying about how you could translate these things into materials rather than works or like pieces of jewelry, like as an influence to that, I think is super interesting, because there's this whole narrative throughout the process that, you know, kind of questions whether something is transforming or in like a solid state. And there's points at which it's both. And so I think like at each part of the process, there's something else to be gained, or like another question to be asked about, you know, who, not just ownership in it, but, you know, who is playing an active role and who is participating in the project overall. And I think, you know, when we were chatting about this the other day, we were kind of talking about all of these different roles that are present in artistic practice and in making, and that, you know, the artist, no matter what medium they're working in, whether it's a digital medium or a physical medium, or in this case both, is not creating in a vacuum. Like even if they themselves like have full physical agency over a work, you know, even to Darja's story, the fact that you posted that image on your Instagram in itself is a process of like, people are conditioned to feel that there's some ownership over those images. And so it's this interesting relationship where we're like kind of dipping in and out of technological spaces as well as kind of like a physical practice. And it's not just what, you know, we might think as artists or critics or curators, but also, you know, how people are interpreting what we're putting out there and who is involved in the process. You know, because jewelers know this, like not all jewelers are making every single thing that is coming out of their studio. You know, they're enlisting help even in the most kind of like basic sense if you take technology out of the process. But, you know, I think technology also is like, we use that to describe things now that, you know, what you're doing at your bench was technology at some point also, so.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point also because we designed it as the starting stage to show the project as a dream, while we don't control what the algorithm is showing. And once you take a screenshot, you think you took one design the algorithm made, but in a sense, the model has been trained and it is now in a certain state. And it can create like close to infinite amount of pieces of jewelry. They might be really similar, but I think it's interesting to look at the model as maybe a piece of jewelry that doesn't exist in a 2D image, but we can only look at it from certain angles, and we always get a 2D image if we look at it. But an image is only like a one perspective of what the model really is. It's like it's you could see it as a higher dimensional thing where we look at one perspective and we see a 2D image and we go at another side. So I think it's really interesting. Like we have a tendency to take these images and screenshots also during the training. It was so interesting to constantly save images. But once you do that in a way, we're already starting to curate the model and think about what we find interesting. I think it's very typical for us to try and do that. But in a sense, it changes what the output is, in a sense, I think.
Yeah.
What happens when you start putting the screenshots into the feeding the algorithm with the screenshots of things that it's creating?
This is something I had this funny idea of like not applying, but like using generated images in our own artificial intelligence project, like as if we were submitting for like the project. But then Greg said like, but the output will look, or like it will look very similar in a way. Or yeah, because you already like, you know, that there's like a danger of sameness, or like, I'm not sure if like Dovilė and Lee, if you experience something like that with feeding like the aquarels back into it. This is something that I'm curious about as well, because yeah,
it did become maybe if you feed back it too much, it might become very well, it won't differentiate as much, I would say. Like generally in AIs, the bigger your data sets, the better. We are kind of in AI terms, we're using a very small data set. Mm-hmm. If you say you use 968 images, it's very small, and the training is very hard because it's easier for an algorithm to just learn the images by heart than it is to learn something, to generalize something. And if you would feedback it, I think it would like they call it model collapse, and it would deviate less and less from what it knows, and it would be like they say it collapses, and the output might be less interesting. But it also depends on the design of the algorithm, I think, what the influence would be.
Yeah, Dovilė and Lee, is that something that I see you like nodding a bit? Is this something that you're like that you came across in the project while you were working on it, or like what is your reaction on that?
I think, Lee, since you are doing the algorithm, maybe you have other perspectives, but for me, it's just to see what happens in the end. And there are these two images that we picked now as, well, best outcome somehow. And one is with, one is the one before the watercolors are added, and the one is after. And they're very similar in, well, aesthetics or even the pieces. But one thing that I was just thinking of, that they are, the one with the watercolor is added is much more delicate and dreamy. And I was just thinking that you were adding pieces that are physically made by people, and these dreaming sessions emerge. But the other piece that has nothing to do with any human, well, the evil eyes from 3,000 years ago were made by humans. Yeah. But those images are very abstract and very strange. I think they're 3,000 years old, most of them, because we wanted to use images that, not images, but pieces that are emerging at the dawn of civilization. And this is at the end of where we are now, to have this contrast, the past and the present or the future. So that's what happened. And that's interesting also to show maybe a piece which would have one side which is having that human, well, in this case watercolor in, and the other side is only the AI creation somehow. So I don't know, Lee, if you have something else to add to this.
Yeah, I maybe want to try to bring in another perspective from the field of music, which I think has a lot of parallels and was done a long time ago. If you think about the work of John Cage, or Alvin Lucier was one of his collaborators, he has a piece, I think it's from the 60s, where he sits in a room and he records his voice at a specific distance. And then he records the recording of his voice, and then he records the recording of the, and so on ad infinitum. And the end result is so distant from the original articulation that it becomes new. But I think what's beautiful about that process is you get to see the nuance in between of the shifting. And I think it's necessary that, we realize that at the moment, this is a tool. It's like sitting at a jeweler's bench and using a file. We're still trying to discover the possibilities of these devices. So specifically related to this idea of feeding things back into the algorithm, we intentionally are using the output as inspirations to change, with the idea that there are thousands of collaborators now that are working with us. And we've talked about this idea before about authorship. It's, you have companies that are putting, money into the hardware to then allow this output to occur. So technically, they're a collaborator in this project as a potential jeweler, which is interesting. So I think, back to the idea of this sort of feedback loop, the idea for us is to use it as inspiration for creating something that will be physical. Just as though you look at a beautiful vista and you say, oh, the colors that I witnessed as a human being at that point in time influence the piece that you're seeing now. The output of the machine is just, from my perspective, it's an inspiration to create something that is further from just the output itself. I don't know if that's helpful in any way, but that's just kind of another perspective.
Yeah, well, what I think, what makes the John Case piece so interesting is it's in the physical world. He keeps recording the physical room, and that adds more and more noise and subtlety and depth to the work. And I guess what you guys are doing by painting again, you keep adding new physical aspects to it, and that's why I think it's maybe more interesting than what if we would just feed it the digital data right back in without any physical interaction anymore.
Yeah, because it went through you as artists again, like in a way got translated to you again, and then got fed again into the machine. Yeah, so
I also want to add some about the Alex raised or Lee raised a very interesting question about the materiality of the data, and it reminded me of Annika Peterson project Glitched in the Copy, where was when we start thinking about the data as something ephemeral and mortal in a way, more ephemeral than the physical material is, when, it started in new media art, when artists just messing around with the hardware, plugging in and plugging out of the computer and producing some glitches, But if we think about the digital materiality as something that is very sensitive and about something that has this skin, then it becomes very intriguing in terms of, I think William Gibson even said about this bit rot, when there is a certain deterioration of the data, it's very
Darja, in your own practice, like the digital plays a central role, and images, how, if we're talking or thinking about like digital adornments, so to speak, how can we connect with digital pieces? Like, what is the role of the person making these pieces, or like what is the role of the body, or like the physical interaction? So the maker as well as the wearer, like who will wear these pieces? How can we connect with them?
Well, I think that jewelry as a discipline is very kind of sensitive towards technological and different cultural development, and I think it will adapt to different formats, whether it's digital identity, whether it's a physical body. And I understood it throughout my experiments and projects, because regardless of the material, whether it's physical or digital, a viewer can still feel the response that is located in their bodies. So actually, yeah, like my last exhibition, there was like 3 video works, and so there was like 4 major haptic moments in the video that I thought that they are the most haptic. You know, there's like how the cosmetic brush leans against the cheek, against the skin, and the second moment was how the needle pricks the skin, and then there was a blood, and the tapping of the stone with the nails. So I thought obviously people would react mostly on them, but it turned out that there was some moments that the desire to transfer the scene sensation to own body by closing the eyes. You know, I wanted to close my eyes and to feel this sense of how is it to have this material brush on my face. But it happened not only with a brush, but with a face filter. So a lot of people said that I want to experience this distortion of my face with my body. So they kind of closed their eyes and imagine. So I called it haptic imagination. So, you know, when we, I borrowed from one director who took as an example experimental dreams where the sleeper is influenced by a sensory object, and he assumes that the touch in these situations becomes kind of autonomous from other feelings. So I made a kind of conclusion that not only the physical materials, but also the materiality of the data, the glitch or acceleration motion in video can produce this haptic effect in the viewer's body. So that is very exciting for me as a jeweler, because to experiment with a jewelry image as something that has its own materiality, sensitivity, for example, like distortions or glitch, and experiments with the body interactions, that we all afraid of our body, but we also desire to be touched in a pleasant way. Also,
Alex, I would like you to also, like, your current, or like the jewelry phone, I was going to say like current project, because it's also presented now during Munich Jewellery Week. I would like to bring you into the dialogue, specifically because with this project you deliberately choose to leave the visual aspect out, which is so important in what Darja was just talking about, as well as in like the live dreaming sessions. It's in our current digital culture, like it's the visual prevails, but how does this relate to like other senses and multisensory experience, and like the body, what we were just talking about? Can you maybe share your view on that?
Yeah, sure. I was just thinking as you were talking, Darja, about the ways that we can kind of reinterpret or influence a certain feeling for people that may be, it may be something that we're trying to offer, but as you said, it can also result in people kind of having a request for how they want to feel something, or how they want to experience something. And it's funny, before you said haptic imagination, I was thinking about the idea of like a jewelry imagination, which is like almost a little bit separate to dreaming, in this way that it's like, how do you think about these things? And so like the jewelry phone in the first instance, so this presentation now is kind of like a third iteration, but the first instance, it was a physical installation that asked people like pretty abstract questions about jewelry, like how does jewelry make you feel, or what does jewelry feel like? And people really like kind of struggled to answer these questions, because like they were really like forcing people to think about jewelry in a way that wasn't observational, but was like what does it mean to you? What's the tactile like feeling of it? Which, you know, is really interesting to me in a kind of like post 2020, post pandemic world too, because I wonder if I had asked people these questions today, I think I'd get a very different response, because I think people have really like found a stronger relationship to the physicality and like the tactility of jewelry in ways that if they maybe weren't thinking about that at all before. I think a lot of, you know, the people on this panel are thinking about this all the time, but and so for me, you know, the second like iteration of this was to really kind of like push the boundary of how people feel or interpret materials or shape or form and these things, to get people to create this like, you know, you're imagining this image when it's being described to you. So like the current jewelry phone is like a web-based exhibition that, you know, uses the work, is a group show of like 8 artists, but, you know, I reinterpreted those works into what I've called jewelry poems, that are, you know, not direct descriptions of the materiality, but, you know, kind of an abstract interpretation of those pieces. And so like the idea is to be able to kind of listen to these things, and you might be imagining it, or you might think you know what it is, like you're trying to kind of guess, but it's really more to kind of think about how you can, yeah, I mean, in the same way that, you know, these reinterpretation of images through an algorithm, you know, you can kind of force people to reinterpret the way that they think about an object, the way they think about a material, the way they think about a shape. And you can do that through anything. It can be through sound, it can be through touch, it can be through, you know, like I think you would have a totally different reaction, for example, the works that are in this current show of the jewelry phone, if you were to put them in a black box and touch them without being able to see them, versus seeing them, versus seeing a digital image of them, versus hearing a description of them. Because in each setting, you're being influenced by some other factor that's coming in, you know, like in the audio, it's your experience of the audio, but it's also like, you know, more like reading a book. You're creating the images that you're experiencing, rather than that kind of like direct one-to-one relationship between what you're seeing. And I just love the idea of bringing these different modes of experience for open to people's interpretation, because I think it like widens the scope of how people can see things, or how people allow themselves to think about something outside of like this kind of physical space of jewelry. Like you don't have to think about jewelry that way. It gives people permission to think about it differently. You're on mute now.
This is very exciting because, like, you know, each person has own skills of interpretation and vocabulary and so on and so on, and how to express your own experience, you know, from the jewelry into words, which is really like kind of coded into your body. So, but it's actually, I think the language is the most suitable way. There is no other mediums for expressing your own experience rather than the language, right?
Yeah, but something always gets lost, I think. If you put experience into language, it's like it represents it, but it doesn't fully grasp it ever, in my opinion.
But there is, yeah, I agree, but there is no better way of...
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
True. I do feel that there's always something lost, in a sense. Like you can do so many things with language and describe concepts and describe experience, but I do feel like experience is in a sense above language.
Also, there is no many words to describe your own body feelings. You know, something is like pricking. You know, I don't know. It's very the specter of these words are limited sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of editing that happens too in the kind of linguistic space, whether it's through intentional editing, whether it's through like you said, maybe a lack of like appropriate terms that exist. You know, different languages have different kind of ways of interpreting things. But it's interesting to think about how like the algorithm, for example, is not as restricted in that way. Like it's not editing things for perfection. It's creating things just based on an input. So it's interesting also to think about the freedom that, like, you know, in the case of the Intelligems project, like there's some freedom, even though it's being manipulated on a specific input. There's a freedom of like a freedom from editing, at least of itself, that the algorithm has in a certain way, which is an interesting kind of agency that it possesses because it's not concerned about the outcome. It's only being influenced by, you know, how it's able to create.
Yeah, and like trying to go beyond ourselves and trying to like give up that control, or like the decisions that we would make, is like one of the aims with the project, because we can't predict what comes out. So I see there are some questions and like comments in the chat. Okay, so one from Ilaria at Twitch. Do you think that a generated 2D image can still be considered jewelry if it cannot be worn or touched in any way? Does any of you would like to comment on that one?
Well, I think the story is interesting with the person that saw the screenshot. For her, it was a jewelry until she didn't know it didn't exist. So I think jewelry is always, in a sense, bound to our own minds. If there's nobody to call something a piece of jewelry, is it still jewelry?
Yeah, it's like it's like this big question, like what is jewelry? But I mean, yeah, it can be so many things as well. But still, it's interesting because when you're experimenting with these technologies, it challenges these characteristics, like as Ilaria mentions in the question. It can't be touched, like it can't be worn as such. It would have to be like translated into something, or there have to be like a different kind of body, like an avatar, or I don't know what, that like wears these pieces.
I mean, I would maybe ask the question also of, there are pieces of jewelry that exist in such kind of protective space that they also can't be touched or worn. So, you know, for example, you know, a piece that exists in a museum, like while it is able to be touched and worn, you are not able to touch or wear it. So, I mean, I think it's like, it's interesting to think about like the mediation of the medium or the format in which you're experiencing something can often be equally as restrictive as that. So I think there's this kind of, there's this interesting relationship between experience and access. And I do wonder, like, at what point access to something makes it real or not. And again, as you said, like if it lives in your, if it lives in your mind, then like potentially it's as accessible to you as a physical object.
Yeah, I think definitely now also with COVID, most of the jewelry we see nowadays, it's only the images. Most of the jewelry, you know, is probably you only seen it in books and images. How many pieces have you touched physically or worn compared to how many you saw somewhere in a book or online?
I think Annalene, you wrote an article for Current Obsession 7th issue, and you mentioned that something like the first thing I see, these are the images of the jewelry, and sometimes I even think that I own them. You know, it's my personal collection.
That's true, because you know, you're browsing the internet and you're saving these images of amazing pieces, and I have like this folder with jewelry pieces on my desktop, and it's almost, you know, it's like this thing that, you know, the representation before you see it in real life, and then you go to an exhibition and there the real piece is, and you're like, oh my God, like the piece that is in the folder on my computer for so long and that I admire is here. Like it's this, like the same with souvenirs of the Mona Lisa, and then you see it at the Louvre or something, you know, like I think I see it in a similar light, in a certain way. These digital reproductions, and it's true what to pick up on what Alex just mentioned, like in a way in one of the articles in the Shows and Tales book by AJF, it is said that like in a showcase, you also have a mainly visual experience of the piece. It's almost like as if it's like a 2D flat image, whereas like the physical piece is laying there. So there is like a similarity between that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about them as two screens, like these
Yeah.
kind of like the like the intermediary of like a glass barrier in both of these contexts.
Yeah, definitely. I see there is like a parallel discussion going on in the chat. Let me go back to it. Like, would it be possible to execute a jewelry able to shapeshift, sorry, to maintain the transformative quality of the AI images morphing according to the data, dynamic data?
I think we were talking about it earlier.
Yeah.
About the...
I'm checking. Yeah, I love when these parallel conversations happen in the chat as well. But anyway, I see that it's already like 4:30, and I would like to add in a little Q&A. So I would like to ask if the audience, so to speak, that is present today would like to ask the speakers some questions or would like to comment on something. You can place it in the chat or you can unmute yourself, up to you. If not, we can ask one more questions ourselves as well. No, it stays silent. Well, we have many more, to be honest, but we won't be able, I mean, let's choose one of them. What, like, when we talked a lot about like the potential, but like, what are the threats that each of you sees? Or like, how do you think that we should like approach AI in a critical way and like in an ethical way in jewelry practice? What are things that you see, that you think people should be aware of?
I can jump in just very briefly. I've been thinking a lot about this idea, and it's sort of an explosive subfield within machine learning, which is around synthetic data. I mean, you're seeing it within the deep fakes that are being produced, you know, with people swapping heads online and taking others for something that's real. And I think there's a certain level of almost counterfeiting that can happen within synthetic data of real objects. It goes back to this quality that we were just talking about of the preciousness of something that could be a one-off versus in multiples. And I think this question about synthetic data plays into this practice of using AI as a tool currently. And that's exactly what the StyleGAN is doing in this moment, right? We're generating synthetic images. I think the critical lens in terms of looking at that is it's basically, it's around this idea still of the authorship, right? Is this something that's just being emulated that already exists, or am I really producing something that is of original quality? And I think this idea of synthetic data is, we're going to start seeing a lot more of it, especially in these adversarial attacks that are occurring now. And how can you find a filter for screening what is synthetic and what is not synthetic? So imagine an association of jewelers who sort of acts as that intermediate layer to say, this is a synthetic piece versus a non-synthetic piece, and what repercussions that might have as practitioners. So it's just something that's been on my mind, is this idea of the synthetic data source.
That's super interesting in the jewelry space. Also, thanks for bringing up deep fakes. I was thinking about this the whole time, like this idea of like, a lot of my practice has really been interested in like commodity value as well. And so I do wonder about how the kind of digital space like serves to potentially create new commodities, like as we're all seeing right now, like the NFT space is like creating a lot of wariness, I guess, of like who owns what and who has like control in the situation. But I think like the thing that, obviously the big question around like AI as a bigger tool outside of jewelry is obviously like what power you have in terms of what you're teaching algorithms and what you're giving them. But I think just to stay out of that big bucket of conversation, in the context of jewelry, like what is the algorithmic responsibility in terms of representation? Like back full circle to what Darja was saying in the beginning is like, we have this picture built for us of what contemporary jewelry looks like, or what fine jewelry looks like, or what any of these kind of categories based on what we're experiencing. So like as the author of this project, or as a curator who works with AI, or as someone who is building these things, what responsibility do you have to the outcome for your audience? Not just what you're putting into it, but how you're speaking about the role that you play. Like, is this your work, or is this the algorithm's work, or is this other people's work? Because I think how people experience the end result is really more related to the medium or the form in which they experience it, rather than the entire narrative of like the process and the story. And I think in the example of this project, you've done a really good job of you're telling the start to finish narrative, but not all projects are doing that, or able to do that, or whatever it might be. So I think it's interesting to think about the landing space and what responsibility you have to how people are interpreting that space based on like the very beginning of this like nascent idea that might involve these kind of technologies.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I have something as well to add. I think it's to your question, what is important to think of is I think a lot of jewelry pieces, and for example, the one that we chose to work on, can address some of these questions just with what they mean to us. For example, the evil eye is a lot about superstition. And I think it can address a lot of superstitions that we have towards AI at the moment, which is kind of what, generally people think about what's going to happen, and, these kind of superstitions. So we can use jewelry as a tool to talk about this, to remind people of this, or to somehow use these. I think you said, Annalene, in the introduction, or this other time that we spoke, that it can address some jewelry foundations. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a lot in jewelry that can speak to such a thing as artificial intelligence. And there are a lot of specific pieces or specific genres or things. So this is from my perspective anyway.
I'm curious to hear, Dovilė. Did the project that you are currently working on with Lee, did it change your perspective on jewelry so far?
Yeah, I think so.
Besides,
yeah, I think so. I think it's I mean, it's a very it's so different. It's just so different than all my other projects, because well, maybe because it is really based in the computer right now, and how we will translate it, and the way I work is very intuitively with materials. My work is all about materials and textures and walls, floors, and ceilings, and the body. So I think this is why I really want to make it physical, because I think that way we can understand, or I can understand AI through the body, through touching, through texture, through a specific material, which is glass, which can break, which is brittle, but not, but it's solid still. So.
Can I ask Dovilė about the materiality, because it made me think that we were watching this dreaming session, and I was thinking, what the material, these images or the representation could be, because for that dreaming session a lot of different images from other artists were used, and different artists use different materials, you know, leather, plastic, so on. But do we feel this at these images? Actually, it's something very hybrid and kind of continuous and similar and the same. It's like everything is very colorful, and at the same it's kind of nothing. Does it have this kind of personality, right? And how could we describe it? For sure, it has some kind of aesthetical properties, right? But this, we can't say, is it leather, is it wood, or is it something, you know?
I mean, if I think about it, if I look at the dreaming sessions and I look at these images, I just think that the same pieces that the artist made should be used to remake them somehow. But it's just from a intuitive.
What do you mean with that one? You mean the artists, or like, because you mentioned the same pieces?
I don't know who should make it, but I think don't ask me that, Emily. I don't know. But the same materials that were used to make those pieces should be somehow used again.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
But at the same time, somebody said as well that it looks like a totally new material, something maybe unseen before, because it's so. I don't know what that
is from the original pictures in a sense. It could be something in between, like.
Yeah, like Darja just said, like it's quite hybrids. And sometimes it's really, you're like, oh, this really looks like gold or something. But then on the other hand, or like the next moment, it's something that is like, I don't know, merging between different materials.
It looks very material. I don't think that it's your friend Darja, who thought it was real. I don't blame her. I mean, it does look real. Sometimes it looks like even melted metal at 850 degrees, which I know how it looks.
Yes. It
with
has
the
a lot
skin
of
on top and stuff.
So it will be a very hot piece
so
if we make one.
It's so interesting that when we look at it, I mean, your brain is like programmed in trying to, like, I have the feeling that it's going to pearls or to like chains, but then you're like, no, it doesn't think in that way. It's not.
I think because the algorithm is designed in the way as our visual cortex as kind of an inspiration in how it finds patterns in the images, because we feel like we see a total image when we look, but basically we only see a very small part, and our brain fills in the rest. And I think there's a very great link between how the machine takes these kind of, how would you say, shortcuts of how something might look, and how does our own brain fill in the picture of what we're experiencing in the real world. Because we always think we see in photorealistic quality what even that isn't real in a sense. I think because there's a very big likeness between the neural nets and our visual cortex, that's why it's easy for our brain to see them as things that might be like visual illusion or something like that.
Yeah. And I had the same question that Darja had before as well. People like asking, like, is this a new piece? Is this a real piece? Like, what is real is a very interesting question as well. And I think it has to do with like the tactile qualities of the generated images, so to speak, but also with like the generated shadows, which are very interesting as well, because it learned to generate shadows that seem quite realistic, and you have the feeling that you can sometimes almost pick it up from the screen as if it's like a material object. I think that's, I don't know, I'm very excited by those shadows as well. I think it's quite fascinating that it does something like that. But on the other hand, of course, because the input also had shadows, so it's also, in a way, it's also natural that something comes out of it.
Annalene challenge, making shadows material.
Yes. I think it would be super interesting to to do it with like a bunch of artists and like maybe, you know, like challenge ourselves in how to translate this to something physical, and then each of us would like do it in a different way. But I think it would be so exciting. Just
and I think
out there. Munich Jewellery Week 22.
I think not only physical, because like coming back to the threads, you know, one of the thread could be formulated as like, you know, it leads us to less originality, you know, it's kind of uniformic or, you know, but I think that in general, visual culture were always defined by talents and artists as something kind of special in a way. And yesterday I was listening to the session, and there was thing about the creativity and about interaction, that algorithm interacts. And it made me think about that. Actually, creativity doesn't come from machine per se, but it comes from interactivity, like how artists interact with the software, because it doesn't come from developers. We are those who are using softwares, and we like report the bugs, and you know, we are kind of expanding the basic features of software, you know, in some way, and next generation of developers make this softwares more like new, and this comes from interaction, you know. So this is our kind of task to interact with this.
Yeah, like playing around with it and and interacting with it. Yeah, definitely. To wrap it up, is there anyone that would like to say something before we close this wonderful conversation that I could have for hours? No? Okay. Then I would love to thank each of you for being here today. Each of the speakers, Darja, Alex, Lee, and Dovilė, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your works, your projects,